And the reason why I usually try to set up with what it is that I do is because people say, you're an ethicist, you're a bioethicist, what does it even mean to be an ethicist? You actually can have a career doing ethics work. What I do for the most part is I work in the hospitals. I'm a clinical ethicist, so I work in the Methodist system, so it's community hospitals as well as the big tertiary center, addressing ethical issues. Usually consultations are called by patients or families, or clinicians regarding ethical issues. It's often involving discordance between clinicians and family members about prognostic information, a lot of medically inappropriate cases. I do a lot of them, somewhere upwards of 500 a year, so a lot of mediation. I'm not a surgeon, I'm actually a lawyer by training, I'm a mediator by training. So that's why that's a good deal of what I do is mediating disputes in the hospital system. But for my research, I actually do something a little bit different, which is that I look at patient perspectives in decision making, particularly around LVADs. So we have a couple of federally funded grants looking at how patients make decisions, the types of information they consider important for decisions about LVAD placement. And it's pretty interesting work, really, for the most part, but I'm not talking about that at all today, really. I'm talking about the ethics of tissue engineering and xenotransplantation. I will carry over some of that work, though, with regards to patient perspective and what they consider important around life-sustaining therapies. All right, meet Eclipse. She's half zebra, half horse, or Zorse. How many people by a show of hands think, ooh, there's something a little off, weird, awkward, maybe even repulsive about her? Anyone? Oh, why isn't she appearing? There she is. She's cute. Right? How many people by a show of hands think, there's nothing wrong with her, she's maybe even kind of cute. Yeah, she's pretty, I think. Let's take it up a notch. Then we got this guy. He's at University of Massachusetts, where they genetically engineered mouse skin to be less immunoreactive to human skin. And then they put on a polymer-shaped ear right there, and then you get this guy. How many people by a show of hands say, something seems a little off, intuitively, just gutturally, something doesn't seem right? Anybody? I need to see those hands. It's kind of blind. I have some lights coming at me, and it's really blinding. Thanks. All right, how many people say, he looks just fine to me to have an ear on his back? Anyone? Okay. He doesn't know? Okay, that's important. Maybe the other mouse or mice are making fun of him for looking a little awkward. All right, then we got this guy. We don't actually know much about him because he's from China, and China doesn't tell us much, but we do know he has a nose on his head. What did they use here? Probably some tissue expanders for sure. Probably some plates and some screws, probably some cartilage from his ribs, and formed a nose, which they could then rotate down into place. His existing nose, he'd suffered from some nasal trauma from a car accident, so they were going to try to build a nose, rotate it into place. How many people think this looks a little creepy? Or something just seems off? Okay. How many people say, hey, look, if it's for his betterment, I think it's just fine. There's nothing repulsive about it at all. Okay, I am curious if anyone is willing to share. There were definitely very few hands with regard to the zebra, Eclipse. There were some more hands with the mouse, and there seemed to be fewer, although they were tentative hands, fewer hands with regard to the man from China. We don't even know his name. On what basis are you drawing the distinction between these three images? In other words, why, in some images, did you consider it ethically acceptable, or at least not unacceptable? And in other cases, you were a little bit more hesitant. Were there any factors that stood out to you as to why you were drawing distinctions between the different images? Yes?
I got to choose if you wanted to grow a nose.
Okay, very good. So from an autonomy perspective, which is clearly an ethical consideration, we put a lot of weight in. He knew what was going on, and he agreed to it. What else? He is human. Can you elaborate a little bit? Okay, so just moving from that preclinical onto the human creates a little bit of a guttural response. Yes?
I think on the mouse, the stigma related to rodents.
Okay.
And, humans are like, yep, there's rodents, I think that's the way we turn off the bag.
Fair enough. Anything else? Although that ear has taken up half of his body. Anything else on factors that stood out to you as to what is acceptable or not acceptable? Okay. So what I'm going to be talking about today is xenotransplantation, or procuring animals and transplanting them into humans. I'm going to talk about the ethics of it. I'll touch on, just slightly, tissue engineering and the ethics of that. Now, I'd really like to stand up here and give you really nice, concrete, definitive ethical recommendations. But what I'm really going to be doing is just kind of skimming the surface, giving you an ethical landscape. And the reason why is because of where we are at in the science. We don't have a lot of ethical consensus at all, actually, in this area. We don't have a lot of ethical guidance. If you look at the professional guidance statements, they're old. They're very old, actually, and they're in need of revisions. So we don't have a lot to go off of. And when you don't have a lot of ethical consensus, I actually think it can be a little dangerous, or at least lacking prudence on the part of an ethicist, to give definitive recommendations, because you've got to be able to adapt to the science. And right now, the ethics is very much lagging the science, at least within the last few years, which is really, really sped up. And I think you're going to learn a little bit more about that later today. All right, transplants. We need organs. We all know we need organs. The demand for organs greatly outpaces the supply. Supply has stayed stagnant, at least over the past decade, despite the efforts on the living donation front, despite education efforts. Really hasn't done much for us at all. Xenotransplantation offers the possibility of an unlimited supply of organs, and for that reason, it really is alluring. Being able to procure organs from animals and transplanting them into humans. The challenge is that we've really been trying this since about the 1960s with baboons and chimpanzees. Not a lot of success just because of the immunological barriers. But there have been some inroads, some new developments about the past 3 or 4 years that have, I think, revived the possibility of xenotransplantation. And that's the reason why the ethics is trying to catch up. It's a little lagging. So what are those newer developments that maybe makes us think xenotransplantation offers an area of promise? These little guys, pigs. We've learned a lot about pigs and how they can help us. They're a great suitable source of organs for a lot of different reasons. One is there's no breeding issues. We can breed them till we're blue in the face. Their organs are also the same size as humans, which makes them nice for that reason. But there have been immunological barriers. The other issue with pigs that has really posed a major barrier for a number of years is that they have a DNA sequence that has a lot of remnants of viruses, and the virus can actually be carried over to humans. We know it can cross species lines. So from a public health perspective, from a public health ethics perspective, that's a little dangerous. Well, it's actually very dangerous because you can impact everyone with the virus or the infections. But a couple of developments since around 2012 that maybe makes us think we can probably do something about those viruses. One is gene editing, particularly CRISPR. The thing with CRISPR, it's pretty cheap, it's pretty easy to employ. It's a type of gene editing that's very simplistic, where you can find a problematic area in the gene sequence and splice it with an enzyme. And that's why you've got this illustration right here. It's pretty easy to do. We don't really know how it works. The reason why this is important from the perspective of pigs is in the past few years, they have been able to identify 62 harmful sequences, so those virus sequences, in pigs, in kidney cells in pigs, and have been able to splice all of the 62 dangerous cells, which could lead to as much as a 1,000-fold reduction in the chance of any sort of virus being carried over to human kidney cells. So for the first time, we're thinking, hey, with gene editing, we can maybe get rid of some of those barriers we've had with xenotransplantation before. Maybe we can procure organs, at least from pigs, at least on the virus side. And this led researchers just got so excited about CRISPR and what it could do, particularly private companies, spending upwards of $100 million trying to figure out how we can have human trials using genetically modified pigs. So clearly it's a very alluring area. And some have said by 2020 we want to have humans enrolled in trials. And look at all the different ways we can use pigs, possibly. Now I do have to say the timeline I think is a little off. Trying to get all of this done by 2020 is just a little too ambitious, and one of the reasons why is just the FDA. The FDA is saying, wait a minute. They actually issued a report to Nature pretty recently that said, we're just really fearful of pathogens. We're fearful of viruses. We're concerned about what you're doing with the splicing. We don't really know how it's working, why it's working. You could impact the entire ecosystem when you're destroying viruses that maybe serve some sort of utility for the pigs or maybe from other animals in the ecosystem, and you're moving all of that around. It makes us nervous. This could have a pretty big public health impact. And if you look at most major epidemics, they start with animal pathogens, and we're scared. That's basically what the FDA said. And even if we could assure safety, questions remain on whether pig organs would work just fine in humans. Take that kidney. Do we know they would be responsive to human hormones that control urination, for instance? We don't really know. So would it actually even work when it was carried over? So the science aspect we're still unsure of. Not even the ethics, just the science. I'll talk about the ethics in just a second. And we know that pigs only live for maybe 10 years. Their organs don't have the same lifespan that our organs have, but I think the rebuttal argument to that would be, well, they could at least serve as bridges until a human organ comes along. Then you have all the scar tissue and other things to deal with, but it could work. So the science, we gotta settle out the science. What is the ethics of using pigs in gene editing? One of the biggest ethics considerations that I think we need to be mindful of that has not gotten nearly the attention it deserves in the literature is just we don't know a lot about gene editing and what we're doing and what the consequences would be to the ecosystem, to public health in general. The second consideration that has been raised in the context of using pig organs for humans is, would it be moral to raise pigs solely for the purpose of procuring organs? Frankly, in my opinion, I think this consideration has been given way too much attention in the literature because we use pigs for food. We use them for valves. And if you're trying to determine what would be ethically appropriate in using pigs, the evaluation would be whether it is creating more benefit for adults, for humans, and whether that outweighs the risk that there is to the pigs. And that is pretty ethically surmountable. That is the consideration. If you were evaluating whether to use pigs solely for the purpose of procuring organs, that is how you would evaluate it. Is it benefiting humans in a way that outweighs any risk posed to pigs? And I think arguably yes. So that's a pretty low threshold to make, or to meet. All right. Other things we can do with pigs. Anyone recognize this image? Anyone take Greek mythology back in college? CHIMERA. Half lion, half goat towards the back there, or the spine, and then towards the tail you've got a snake. Fire-breathing Greek mythological character. Usually a sign of a bad omen. Bad omen, usually a shipwreck. Now, though, it's being used, or at least it's being used colloquially, as a more positive term in science. The CHIMERA in the context of pigs. So that is mixing human DNA and animal DNA, and in this context, the pigs. So what's going on here? Very simplistic diagram. Remember, I'm a lawyer by background, not in genetics. The gene responsible for making the pancreas, the pig, that pig is so cute, it's almost distracting. It looks like a little babe up there. Remove the pancreas from the DNA of the pig embryo. Then you've got a little void inside that embryo. You can inject iPS cells, so those are just adult cells, reprogrammed to be like embryonic cells, which allows us to get around that whole ethical consideration in using embryonic cells, so it's nice. The idea, or the goal at least, would be that those iPS cells would fill in that void left by the animal's missing pancreatic cells inside the embryo. Now, embryos don't have immune systems, so it wouldn't immunoreact at all, or shouldn't, to having human DNA inside. The goal would be that human DNA would fill that void, and then you would have a human pancreas growing inside the pig. That the pig would otherwise be pig, would not lose its pig characteristics at all, but would have this human pancreas growing and developing inside of him. The fetus would develop as normal. Human stem cells fill the pancreas void, create the human organ. After birth, the pig would be allowed to grow to an adult size, and then the pancreas would be removed for transplant. Nice thing about this, if it actually worked, would be that here you would have this beautiful organ that is an exact genetic copy as the recipient, but it's a younger, healthier version of the organ, and you wouldn't need to take immunosuppressants either. So it offers a lot of really good things if the science worked out. Then the the NIH, came in and put a ban on it. Said, we are not going to fund any CHIMERA projects. Very recently, actually, within the past 6 months, I think. Does anyone know why? It's that. Well, I know. That's one thing where you guys have an awfully lofty goals. Actually, they had a much more simplistic, and they had a whole host of very well-known ethicists, respected ethicists that I think the world of. And some of their comments, though, where it was like, really? They're concerned that because you're using iPS cells, those iPS cells, obviously, a goal is that they can become any cell in the body. They could become pancreatic cells, or they could become brain cells. And if they became brain cells, then you've got a pig that possibly has a little bit of human DNA in his brain and could become a little human-like and have the cognition of a human. And the quote here, which I think is fantastic, anyone know David Resnick? Very good ethicist. But this quote is just hilarious. The specter of an intelligent mouse stuck in a laboratory screaming, I want to get out, would be very troubling to people. Yeah, it would be very troubling to people, but we don't really have any hard data to suggest that would really happen. They're basing it off of an unpublished, and I just checked last night to make sure it hadn't been published, an unpublished study that came out of, I don't remember where, I think Maryland somewhere. And it was of a pig where they injected iPS cells, and they were able to see that the congenital eye defects in the pig were somehow reversed as soon as the iPS cells were put in there. And they're like, uh-oh, why did this happen? Why did the congenital eye defect reverse? It must be because those cells somehow became brain cells or eye cells or something up there, and it somehow impacted the cognitive state of the pig, or at least introduced the possibility of impacting the cognitive state. And that scared them. It was that study and one other study, both unpublished, that suggested that there might be some intermingling there. Even if that's not true, and I don't know if it is true, I don't think we really have one way to say either way as to whether this really should be a legitimate concern. But I think for sure we have to admit that we are pushing possibilities for intermingling species. And when you intermingle species, the biggest ethical consideration is that it confers a responsibility to slow down, to watch what you're doing, to publish your results, to make them as well disseminated as possible, to try to encourage ethical safeguards, and to try to encourage developing policies. So if there's any firm guidance I can give at all in the area of xenotransplantation, it would be this. Any work being done in the area, however primary in nature, however elementary, I should say, should be published, discussed in public forums such as this, as conferences. We should try to do as many policy and exhaustive ethical reviews as we can. There are not enough out there. There have not been enough ethicists convening to discuss the considerations involved here. And we have to be willing to revisit and modify our policies on a continual basis. A concern I have in this area, and actually in any area where there's new science, is that we try to be so preventive with the ethical considerations. We try to get right out of the gate enumerating all the different ethical problems. But when you do that, you create a stigma and you do slow down science. You have to be willing to wait just a little bit to see what you're seeing in the science and then use that to inform your ethical reviews. And the ethical reviews have to then inform the science. It's a give and take. You can't come out of the gate with preventive ethical problems and then not be willing to revisit them. And that's exactly how we've been working in this area. Have to engage far more in public discussion. I don't know at all what the public perceptions are about xenotransplantation. I know a lot about public perceptions of LVADs. And I think some of that work actually could probably carry over here, but we do not know at all what the public thinks about xenotransplantation. Some people think there would be some religious objections to the use of pigs. I actually doubt that. Because pigs, every religion puts a lot of emphasis on life preservation and extending life as much as we can, and that should actually outweigh any considerations associated with using pigs. So I don't think the religious objections are going to be all that great. Where I think we're going to have some issues from a public perception perspective is just the intermingling, the CHIMERA sort of interaction. Should intellectual and financial resources be concentrated in this area? It's a tremendous, tremendous amount of resources. A lot of skeptics out there. I don't know how fruitful it would even be. At what point are you spending too many resources in an area where you're not going to get anywhere? And that's one of the biggest ethical considerations with xenotransplantation. A lot of research ethical issues. You can only move to clinical trials once there's been enough preclinical information that's been collected. And the only way to make any sort of progress at that point, the only way to learn any more, is to move to humans. You have to really saturate using animals as far as you possibly can to get to a point where you're like, we cannot make any more progress until we move to humans, and we have reduced the risks of harm to humans as much as we possibly can, and we've maximized the likelihood that the intervention will show benefit. That is a very fine point in science and medicine. Often we get out of the gate too quickly, move to humans too early, or we come out too late. So you want to get that fine little balance where you know it's now time to move. Who should be selected? You know, these sorts of patients are your sickest, obviously, where no conventional therapies would be available to them. That is often associated with a term called therapeutic misconception. It's a term that's gotten a lot of traction, particularly in the cancer literature, which is that if you're working only with really sick patients where conventional therapies aren't working, they're going to be so desperate for anything you have to offer, even if it likely would have very little efficacy, or even where the risks or burdens would be high, or even where their life wouldn't be prolonged but maybe a few weeks or months. And at that point, you're deceiving patients because they're going to be thinking, hey, I could be treated, and they're likely not going to be. Now, that literature is very robust, but my response to that would be, okay, but they don't have an alternative, and you can do all the educating you want, and however they decide to take it is however they decide to take it. Their circumstances are where they're at. It's not because of anything you're doing. We see this all the time with LVAD patients. When we ask them about why did you decide to opt for the LVAD versus maybe continuous medical therapies or palliative care or comfort care measures, they always say, because this was the only choice I had. They could have educated me till I was blue in the face and I would not have cared. This was the only choice I had. This is the circumstance that they're encountering. So the same thing for this patient population up here. Yes, therapeutic misconception is something you need to watch, but I think it could be a little paternalistic to say that you should not work with this patient population at all just because they happen to be very sick. Who should be selected? Adults versus children. You know, most people say you should work only with adults first, and then when it's proved there, then move over to children, but then that means children aren't getting the access, so there's some ethical issues there. What should the informed consent look like? I don't think it's necessarily beneficial to have a 10-page informed consent form enumerating all of the risks and the unknowns, because there gets to a point of comprehension saturation where you cannot learn anymore, and they're desperate anyway because of the condition that they would be in, because they'd be your sickest patients. Where that balance is between ensuring comprehension and overwhelming patients is a fine one, and one we have not achieved. We're trying to get it in the LVAD context, we're trying to get it in the cancer context. I had no idea what it would look like in the xenotransplantation context. But there's a whole literature waiting to be happen right around that area. All right, just real quick, transitioning gears. So if I could summarize where we've been so far with xenotransplantation, I would say we have all these ethical concerns and not a lot of answers to them. Some of the things that we've learned in other areas can be carried over. Some of the things cannot be, but we're in such an early stage that it's really hard to tell what the ethical considerations would be. And so I can't give definitive guidance other than to say we probably should enumerate as much as we can on the research ethics front and then spend our time revising and modifying as the science comes in. And right now we don't have a lot going on. All right, So a little bit on tissue engineering. The ethical considerations here are pretty actually similar, although not nearly as high of a concern as the ones we saw with xenotransplantation. How am I doing on time? Am I okay?
So,
Okay. I've only got like 5 minutes left anyways. All right. So what's going on here? I don't want to spend too much time on it just because I anticipate some of your other speakers, since we've got a lot of cardiac surgeons in the room, will be spending a lot of time on this. But we're just very simplistically using a detergent to remove DNA and lipids and leaving the structural proteins and collagen. Then repopulating with iPS cells. And then with the scaffold, you can use a bioreactors to try to stimulate the heartbeat, and then eventually it will be able to beat on its own, supposedly, after 8 to 10 days. Still very, very infant stage on this. Got it nailed a little bit more within rats. So a lot here that we still don't know. But it does offer some promise, I guess. It's far more successful for tubular structures like this, just because you don't have to line up the iPS cells in the same ways that you would have to do with hearts. Solid organs, it's much more difficult. So what would be the ethical considerations here? This, by the way, has been implanted in humans, so we've made far more inroads with tracheas and bladders as opposed to things like hearts. The biggest issues here are actually a little bit more regulatory, I think, than ethical in nature. One is just the financing. Who will do the financing? What will that approval pathway look like for tissue engineering? You've got some biologics in there, you've got some surgical procedures in there, you've got some medical devices. All of those are governed by different regulatory agencies, all using very different regulatory rules. So who should actually govern this, and what should that actually look like? Therapeutic misconception is a worry here as well. These are your patients with heart failure. These are patients with, whatever kind of end-stage organ failure, where conventional therapies may not work, or have not worked, have been exhausted. And those people are most likely to be susceptible to any benefit, however incremental, even where the burdens are high and even where the efficacy is questionable. And that is something you have to monitor. The irreversibility is an issue here. You've got dynamic cells, active cells. It's a dynamic process. You have to worry a little bit about the variability, the irreversibility. I do wonder, just from more of a psychology perspective, what we would look at in terms of patients experiencing implantation of a artificial heart or a heart that's gone through decellularization process. What happens to them mentally, if anything at all? We do know from the LVAD context that the whole just having something placed inside of them does do something a little bit to their psychology about bodily integrity and who they are and the new normal and what it means to be on a device. So I would anticipate a lot of that would carry over to this context as well. By the way, with the new generation of devices, we're seeing less of that. So as you become more equipped in the science, you start to notice that the psychological sequelae in the minds of patients are much more tolerating of changes and newness and innovation. Access issues is always an issue. You're not likely to get any sort of reimbursement for these innovative projects like artificial organs or tissue engineering. When you don't get reimbursement, then the only people who are really going to have access are those with the money. So then you've got some issues with access as well. I don't know that that makes this context exceptional. There are some access issues just on the transplant side. There are access issues everywhere. So although equity is something we need to be mindful of and something we need to maximize as much as we can, it exists everywhere in medicine. So I don't know that the introduction of these technologies changes that in any way. All right, so this is just my take-home slide. So what do we have consensus on and what do we not have consensus on? We don't have consensus in a lot of areas at all. I don't think there's anything inherently wrong with xenotransplantation, tissue engineering, or development of artificial organs at all. So I'm not the one to stand up here and say, this is ethically impermissible, you need to stop. I don't think I would ever say that, but I definitely wouldn't say that here. But what you need to be mindful of is that you have to be cautious and be willing to revisit within each step. Have some elemental guidelines in the development phase as well as the implementation phase, and then come back and revisit and incorporate public perspective and empirical data as much as possible. And right now, we really don't have it. We don't have a lot of published data. And it needs to be out there. That's about, and then I also mentioned growing human organs in pigs, chimeras. I think that's far more ethically controversial. I don't think that's going to come down the pipeline anytime soon. The NIH put a halt on that, as did just about everyone else. So I think I can say with some certainty that we've got a lack of consensus in that area. It's just too controversial at the moment. All right. And I am a little over, so at this point I'm going to stop. And this was my take-home slide anyway. So any questions for me?